All right, so what we were saying, if the cylinder has wear, that's something that we have to measure, right? So in two different directions, if we have a difference in measurement, that'd be out around, right? You got that? So let's just say this measurement, we'll make it a 4-inch bore. If this was a 400 and this is a 4002, what's that tell you?
It's not
By how much? 2 thousandths of an inch, exactly. So when we're looking at measurements, we're really looking at this digit mostly. That would be 1,000th. So like there's 2, that's 2 thousandths of an inch. Typically the max is 1,000th or maybe less out around. Every cylinder is going to be out around just probably like, let's say the most perfect cylinder you ever found was a 4.000. What if I add a 0 and a 0 and a 0? Eventually, you're going to have something out around. None of them are perfect. The big question about engines is in spec or out of spec. That's really how you have to set your brain. So like with a rotor, right? There's a maximum amount of run out. There's a maximum amount of wear you can have. It's in spec or it's out of spec. In the cylinder, you'd have to look up the specs. If it says you can have 1,000th of an inch, but no more, and you measure it and you're under 1,000th of an inch, you're good. Right? It's more, yes, look at the cylinder by all means, but it's much more than that. We're measuring, we're comparing to spec. Now, if I were to take that cylinder and I were to tip it upright like this, right? So let me get a little bit stuff erased here. If I were to take that cylinder and we were to make it more like the up and down, right? Like this, I'd have to measure here. And sometimes even they'll say in the middle, but let's just say as a minimum, these couple spots. Let's just say I had a 4.000 down near the bottom. And let's say at the top, I had a 4.003. What's that tell me? Not out around. Out around is like when you're looking from the top down. This is more like the top of the cylinder to the bottom of the cylinder. Taper, there you go, bingo. So if I were to measure here and then further down in the same direction but lower in the cylinder, that would be a tapered cylinder. Do you think cylinders are tapered too? Yeah. That's when they're brand new, maybe, maybe not. But when they got some miles, yes, they are, for sure. So I was telling you, I had a student. I'm going to make it about the former student, that way you can't figure out who he was. But he bought a car, and it had the infamous 2JZ. And he's like, oh, yeah, I'm going to rebuild it. He got rings. He got bearings. We pulled it apart. I told him measure it. He measured it. It had like 6 thousandths of taper.
Christ.
And I told him, like, that needs to be bored. It's like, what? No way. It's a 2JZ. Yeah, with a bunch of miles. It's a great engine. The 350 is a good engine. All these engines are good. But when that piston's been up and down in that cylinder a bajillion times, you got a picture. The rings, right, like this has rings on it. These rings are kind of rough, but if I were to pop one of these rings off right here, ooh, they're rough. Come on, baby. Don't embarrass me in front of my friends. But when I take this ring off, you can see this ring it's tough. It actually hurt a little bit. To be honest with you, it hurt. This ring is stiff. It's hard. It wants to expand. This ring is going up and down in that cylinder a bajillion times. Technical term, bajillion. Look it up. A bajillion times. So as this ring goes up and down the cylinder, you know it's going to wear, right? But down at the bottom, like in the very bottom, the ring only goes so far down. Below where that ring goes, that should have no wear. So you can run the tool down and measure your baseline at the bottom. If you got 4000, you can bring it up. You might still have 4000, because when your piston's down near BDC, there's not really a lot of force on it like this. It's just kind of, it's easy down there. When it gets up to the top on compression, it's like, it starts to kind of do a little bit more of this. Up here is going to have some more wear. It's just normal. It's going to have a certain amount of taper. Now the ring can expand and contract, right? So at the bottom, it can kind of be fairly tight. And then at the top, if it's got a little taper, it can open up a little bit. It can basically fill some taper. But if the taper is over spec, it's no longer going to make very good compression. I especially want you to think about something. If our oil is getting sloshed up on the cylinder walls, which is normal, it's supposed to, but you got a couple sets of rings there. If this upper ring is compression, we use the clean one. The second one's also compression. They kind of work together. And then the third one is a different style ring that's mostly to scrape the oil, excess oil off the wall. Well, if you got a whole bunch of taper and your piston ring is trying to expand and contract maximum, but it's got 6/1000 taper at the top, it's probably not really scraping very well, is it? Probably leaving a lot of oil behind. And he's saying, well, it's got oil consumption, but the engine was rebuilt, so it can't be the engine. Thinking like, right.
It is the engine.
Not only is it, we verified it is because we measured the taper on the cylinder. It's got 6/1000 of an inch. That's a problem. Period. Even if it's the infamous and mighty 2JZ.
Does cross-hatching mess with?
It's a good thing, but if you were, let's say you had this cylinder, and let's say this was a car you were diagnosing or getting ready to rebuild or something, you pull the head off and you look. If you have cross-hatching in there, that's a good sign, because the cross-hatching is scratches on the cylinder. It's actually a later slide, but it scratches on the cylinder. As your cylinder wears, you're basically erasing those cross-hatch marks. The fact that there's still cross-hatching means it doesn't have that much wear. However, the way the piston goes, if you look at this cylinder, the piston doesn't typically have a lot of this type of movement. So if you still have cross-hatching on the sides, we'll call those the axial sides. That's fine, but if you have cross-hatching worn on the thrust side, which is like the up and down from this perspective, well, that cylinder's got wear. Not only that, if the cross-hatching is gone on the thrust and there on the axial, you know it's got out around, right? So there's clues. The cross-hatching can give you clues, but the cross-hatching is also necessary. The cross-hatching with all those X's become little spots for oil, and the oil lubricates the rings. If it's got so much wear that the cross-hatching is gone, it's going to accelerate the wear on the rings. That's a problem. Now you could buzz it with the hone and re-cross-hatch it, and that'd be a good baseline, but like you wouldn't really want to do that unless the out around and taper were in spec. So let's say you've got under 1/1000 out around and you got 2/1000 taper and the max is 3. Well, that's within spec. You could go ahead and cross-hatch it and reassemble it. And that's kind of my point. My point is, when you're going to rebuild the engine, you have to know what needs to be replaced and what doesn't need to be replaced. What needs to be bored and what can just be surface honed to get the cross-hatching back in. What needs to have a crankshaft trued and cut, and what just needs new bearings, right? So as a minimum, if you're going to do a rebuild, you're going to have that engine out, apart, extensively cleaned. You're going to do new bearings, main bearings, rod bearings. You're going to probably do new cam bearings on most of them. This is a cam bearing on the small block. If it's a overhead cam, some of those don't have cam bearings. You might not do anything there. Right? So bearings, new gaskets and seals throughout, and new rings. That's your basic overhaul. Does it need more? You gotta check. You gotta inspect. You gotta visually. You gotta measure some stuff. You gotta see, like, are all the bearing clearances in spec? Are all the cylinders in spec? Whatever. And if they are, then a rebuild could actually be pretty cheap. On the low end, you know, if you went on Rock Auto like what I did, this is actually my set of bearings right here. On Rock Auto for a 5.3 rebuild kit, bearings, gaskets, seals, rings, and actually pistons, I think it was like $600. Cheap money. It's a 5.3 though. Some stuff's gonna be more, but still, it was cheap. Now, by the time I got in there and I started realizing, you know, I'm not gonna use the aftermarket rear main seal. I'm gonna buy this and get this. It ended up being a little bit more, but like, and then I'm like, yeah, I need to absolutely have to have that. The head's ported, and I have to port the throttle body, and I have to port the intake, and I have to do header, you know. But I could have just done a stupid rebuild for cheap. That's my thing. That's your baseline. You get in there and the block needs to be machined, your budget just got blown out, big time. Go ahead.
So, at what point is a cylinder being tapered or out around the sleeving?
I'll give you just a basic on that, and then I want to cover that more in 2 weeks. So bottom end stuff right now is overview. If you have an iron block, you can probably bore it. If you have an aluminum block, it depends on the type. Most Toyotas from the factory, you can't bore them at all. So if there's damage, it's basically replaced. Now on some of them, if you really wanted to, you could actually bore it over and sleeve it, but then it becomes like a cost to benefit type of evaluation. Now if it's something that's high performance, a lot of times the engine block would be worth a lot of money, so it might be worth sleeving, but sleeving gets a little bit expensive. You only sleeve if you really have to. Then what some people will do, you could sleeve it for strength, but you're way outside of what we cover for A1. That's like high performance stuff. You could even epoxy all the coolant passages to beef it up. I mean, you could go nuts. I'll talk a little bit more about that in 2 weeks, but generally, as soon as you have to get into that, you're replacing an engine if it's for a customer. Cool, so that should be mostly what we got on the bottom end. You guys feel decent about what we got going on the bottom end? Kind of, sort of. Yes, there's still many more things to cover. Neat. So, let's move on from that. And then this one again. This one is the 4-stroke cycle from Toyota's perspective. I thought they did a pretty good job. So if you start with 1, remember intake valve opens. The intake valve opens because the camshaft lobe controlled it, right? Opens, piston's gonna go down because that crankshaft has the offset rod journal. That's what actually pulls it down, right? The amount of offset from the center line determines how much it has for a stroke. Cool? Gonna come down, gonna turn right back around and start going up on compression. Note, both valves are closed. If you have the cam timing messed up, you might not build compression. The 4-strokes really won't function if you don't have your crankshaft and camshaft in time, okay? The other thing we could say is in sync. You have to have them synchronized, but I don't typically stand up here and tell you that you need to have stuff in sync. You know what I'm talking about? In sync, has it been so long that you don't even know? I'm not singing. Okay? Combustion, exhaust. Same 4 strokes. Cool? There's a little bit of a summary. You guys getting cold?
Yeah.
Are you really?
It's not the cold, it's just the constant air.
All right, good. Intake, look at it. Compression, look at it. Now, what is displacement? Okay, here's a saying for you back in the day. There's no replacement for displacement. Who's heard it?
People still say it.
They do. Okay. Let's get the facts straight. You all are welcome to your own opinions, but you need to at least know the facts, okay?
Yeah.
So, displacement. Bottom dead center to top dead center, that is the displacement. But there's a little bit more to it than that. It depends on, that's basically your stroke right there. So if you look at TDC to BDC and you do that as a measurement, that's your stroke. It's kind of crazy to think about what makes the stroke though. I'm telling you that this crankshaft is actually what determines the stroke. Do you know that? If you were to look at your center line right here, here's your center line, and we're to look at that number 1 rod journal, that number 1 rod journal being off a center line determines how far it throws and how low it throws. Make sense? Isn't that kind of crazy? So if you want to do, let's say, a stroker kit, that would have a different crankshaft and it would increase the amount of stroke. The reason I bring that up, well, this right here in a 1 dimension, this is your displacement. If you want to increase the displacement, what do? Make it go lower, right? If you can make it go lower and then bring it back up to the same TDC, did you or did you not just increase your displacement?
Yeah.
Displacement just means how much air do you displace when you go through a full cycle. And this would be, let's say, pick an engine. How many liters is it?
4.5.
4 liter.
Okay. We'll pick a 4-liter easy math. If you were to take your 4-liter, and let's just lie and say it was a 4-cylinder. If it's a 4-liter, 4-cylinder, that would be 1 liter per cylinder. Make sense? BDC to TDC would be a liter, a liter, a liter, and a liter. That's how you get your 4 liters right there. Now it's over a V6, and it's so or even an inline 6 or whatever on a 3 liter with an inline 6, the math gets more complicated. You see why I jumped all over the 4 liter though. Yeah, that's good. I could do that one. So that's in one dimension what your displacement is. However, and this is what it's kind of saying, right? However, we need to be concerned about the bore. The bore is the size of the hole.
How wide?
So basically, if you have a bore of 3.550 and your stroke was 4.160, you don't just multiply those, because remember, it's actually bore squared, or another way to do it, you'd actually use pi divided by 4 times stroke. It gets a little bit more complicated. It's hard to measure the area of a circle, right? It's not just, like if it's a square, it's length width, but when it's a circle, that's when you have to get pi in there. 3.1415, you know, that number. There's a button on the calculator, you put pi. Pi button. That's how you'd actually measure it. The way that like a race shop would measure, it's kind of interesting. They'll actually bring it down to BDC, and they'll put a quantity of water in it. They'll fill it right dead top, all the way to the top, and then they'll actually get a tray underneath, and they'll turn it over and they'll measure how many cc's of liquid come out. And so like that's actually a pretty cool way to measure the actual displacement per cylinder. But the way the engineers are going to do it, they're more looking at the bore times the stroke and using the formula with pi. So let me give you a fun fact. Pick the biggest engine you're familiar with. How many liters or cubic inches? Cubic inches even better. Anybody know?
Liters, 5.7.
A 5.7 would be about 350 cubic inches. Let's go with that as a baseline. That's what this one is, by the way.
Nice.
First point, if you were to bore it 30 thousandths over, how many cubic inches do you think it is now? If you say 380, you're kicked out. Because that's where I'm going with this. If you take a 350 cubic inch and you bore it 30 thousandths of an inch, you did not add 30 cubic inches. But people are kind of dumb. Ignorance, better word. They just don't know. So they're like, oh yeah, it's a 350, but it's bored 30 over. I can do that math. 350 plus 30, 380. Yeah, I got 380. Like, no, you don't. I guarantee you don't. 30 thousandths of an inch. That's like 10 human hairs. You didn't get no 30 cubic inches out of that. I'm sorry. So if you really wanted to do the math, you'd be like, oh, 3,550. We're going to make that a 3,580. And then times you're going to get a couple cubic inches out of that. Maybe. It's not going to be much. Okay, cool. So you might, a 350 bored 30 over is maybe like a 352 or something. Make sense? Now, let me tell you, you know I worked on locomotives for a while. Those are big diesel engines. Those 16 cylinders. The engines were kind of big. They weren't 350s. They were like, an EMD is a 710.
Cool.
So you think 350 to 710, that's not that big. I'm going to tell you the difference. 350 is all these cylinders combined. When I tell you I worked on a 710, that was just one cylinder. And there were 16 of them.
Whoa.
So now you see the scale. So I specifically recall somebody telling the story that this locomotive broke down and the guy was there with his Cadillac, big old Cadillac. I think it was like Eldorado that had like a 4 something in it, not a 454, so that's a Chevy, but it's 400 and something. And he's like, how big's that engine? He said, and he was talking with the conductor who doesn't really know about the engine. They check fluid levels and safety stuff. He's like, oh, this is a 710. The guy's like, wow, I'm surprised. It's not that big. Mine's like a 450 something. That's only a 710. See how they weren't comparing apples to apples there. He was talking about the whole entirety of his engine compared to being less than one of the cylinders of that. So it's pretty fun. That's displacement. Anybody like a 2 liter? 2 liter displacement? Oh, that's Mountain Dew. Sorry. Not if it's 2 liter, that's supposed to be for soda. All right. And so again, another shot of the bore and stroke you can see times all the cylinders. That's your total. Now, if it was a 4 liter, you know what you got. Now let's discuss compression ratio. Compression ratio is a little more complicated than this, but I'm going to give it to you simple, then I'll add a little. If you were to take this piston and bring it up to top dead center, and let's say you measured 1 centimeter, 1 centimeter from the top of the piston to the top of the combustion chamber. Then you were to bring it to BDC and it were to go down 8, you would take 8 centimeters and cram it up into 1. You see the ratio there? 8 to 1. 8 to 1 is not a real impressive compression ratio, by the way. Newer stuff, we're going with much higher compression ratio. Compression ratio can be used to extract more energy from the fuel, so it can be better for emissions, better for fuel economy. The negative though, it's kind of hard on the gas. So like you got high performance cars, they take 90, 293 octane, 91, whatever it is. It may very well be because it has high compression. High compression is good for power, good for stuff, but you can't be running no Arco 87, okay? You're gonna start getting pinging issues, like you're gonna make so much heat on compression, the fuel is gonna actually start to pre-ignition, maybe even detonation.
Retard time.
And then you lost the power, and so then it's like, no, you really need to run the 91 or maybe better, hopefully. Can't get much better around here. Okay, so that's your basic 8 to 1. Now technically though, I want you to think about something, and the reason I bring this up is because this is gonna build onto a later concept. It's not just simply the 1 centimeter, it's actually the volume of the combustion chamber. So that combustion chamber volume is kind of abnormal. You'd actually need to know how many cc's that combustion chamber is. You need to know how many cc's your cylinder becomes at BDC. Okay, so that's really what we're looking at. It's not just quite as simple as 1 centimeter to 8 centimeters. Okay. Now I'm gonna throw a little something in there. If I were to get carbon on top of the piston, what would that do to my compression ratio?
Reduce it.
Would it though? Because the carbon takes space. So right here on this math, right here, we've got, let's just make it a fibby number, okay? Like a 1, let's make 100 cc's. And then by the time we bring it down, let's make this 800 cc's. So if you do 800 to 100 and simplify that, it's 8 to 1. We agree? Okay. Now, this one's a little tricky, okay? We get some carbon right here. By the way, this is my piston. This has carbon on the piston. That's part of the reason I say this. This carbon has been like kind of built up in 180 something thousand miles. Plus they weren't easy miles, so the truck was not treated real good. But I like it. We get some carbon right there. Do you have 100 cc's anymore? The carbon takes space. So what happened to that number?
Decreases.
All right, so let's make it 90 cc's. Cool? Now when I bring it down to here, it comes off of that too, right? But at a different ratio, right? Because it only really affected the top one. So we might be down to like, let's say 790 cc's. Cool? So now we would have to do a 790 to 90. Can somebody do that math for me? 790 divided by 90?
8.77.
It doesn't have 8 to 1 compression anymore. It has an 8.77 to 1. What happened to my compression? I just proved it to you. Because when you have carbon on the piston, it doesn't affect this proportion equally. It affects the 0.1 side more and the 8 side less because you have all this volume down here. So your compression just went up. Now, later we get into what high compression does. Higher compression causes higher cylinder temperatures, can cause pre-ignition, can cause pre-detonation. Okay, so you got those issues. You might have to start thinking about, hey, does this have higher compression than it was supposed to, and why? Carbon, that could do it. Andres, go ahead.
Is that what we do
Exactly. And on the intake valve, remember when we were talking about valves, you get a bunch of carbon built on this intake valve, and now your port fuel injection spraying, and the carbon's kind of soaking in the fuel, and you're getting not as much air through because it's kind of built up, and the air is like, oh, let's go in the cylinder. Ooh, carbon, nasty. Ooh, and you don't get as much air, and also the fuel's absorbed in the carbon, so you're losing fuel. So that's why it can restore your fuel economy and increase your performance. But also, I've seen that service actually fix some stuff. It's way oversold. I'm gonna tell you right now. it's like, hey, sell it because it's on sale and it pays good. Cool. But it can actually fix stuff, for real. Part of the reason that Toyota went to both direct injection and port fuel injection was to actually keep those ports clean. You know, so it's a thing, for sure. All right, cool. You feel decent on compression ratios? Feel decent on displacement? Did I offend anyone with the 2-liter thing? If you're under 2 liter, we just can't even have this discussion. Tammy, go ahead.
So, my son T has an 8.5 to 1.
Yeah, sure.
I'm thinking about putting a thicker head gasket that's about 2 millimeters thick on top.
Okay.
If it's an 8.5 to 1, would that make it an 8.5 to 3?
Okay.
You got those 2 on top?
I'll give you it. I'll give you it. If you had a head gasket right here, you just added to this, rather than being 100 cc's, maybe you make it 130 cc's. So it might be a 130 to an 8,000 or 800. So it's gonna decrease your compression ratio. Now I'm asking everybody. I just told you how higher compression ratio is better and blah 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 blah. Why would you ever want to decrease your compression ratio?
If you run turbo,
All right, but that's true, so you know it, but why?
because it would add more, it's already adding the volume of air compressed.
Right. So when you turbocharge, supercharge, you're increasing your compression. It's not really your compression ratio though. The compression ratio is strictly volume to volume, but at atmospheric pressure, that's 0 gauge pressure. That's actually like 14.7 if it's sea level. You have a certain amount of pressure coming in on the air. If you pressurize it and you're under boost on that supercharger, turbocharger, you are cramming more air in there, which by the way is how you would exceed 100% volumetric efficiency, like from before. That will increase your compression, just not your compression ratio, right? Your compression ratio predicts about what your PSI should be on compression, but your actual compression is something that you'd have to measure. If you're under boost, trust me, it's making a bunch more compression, like a lot. So now you get into, can the fuel take the heat or not? And you're running 91, that's all you can get at the pump here. 91, maybe not enough, so then that's when you get into either A, race gas, out-of-state fuel, you order drums of VP Racing, 120 octane, that's hard to get. What a lot of people do, they'll go to ethanol. Ethanol has a higher octane rating. The octane rating is the resistance to the fuel breaking its chemical bonds. So you can put it under a lot more heat, a lot more pressure, and it'll still hold on. Then the spark, and then it lets go, right? So it's about control. We need to control that combustion. So you want to run big supercharger, turbocharger, cool. You could do ethanol, but you don't only have to do ethanol. You have to do ethanol in the correct volume, which is a lot more ethanol. And a lot of times your fuel system's like, yeah, no, I don't have to flow that much. I've never had to flow that much. Now you get I need this fuel system and a bigger fuel system. I need this thing. So that's when you get expensive, right there. Helping?
Yeah. Question, since ethanol can withstand higher heat, wouldn't you need a higher ignition spark plug?
No, they'll still fire fine. A lot of times, like the ignition system it tends to not really be the hang up. It tends to more be the fuel volume. Now, what some people will do, they'll tend to try to upgrade all that type of stuff because they've seen like if you're making really big compression, the compression does increase the difficulty for the spark to jump the gap. But like from the factory, usually the ignition systems, it's like they're kind of overkill on the ignition. But let's say you do something wild, a lot of people would go to some aftermarket, higher voltage coils. Yeah, you had another point?
I was just saying that from what I've read for my car, that the spark plugs have like different heat ratings for the tapering on the
Yeah.
and that you actually have to go up the heat rating.
They want it hotter.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like if you do nitrous, they'll actually want you to go a little bit cooler.
Yeah.
You know, and some of that is not quite as much of a science as it is a little bit of trial and error, and then it becomes tribal knowledge. So the people who've done a bunch of those, probably they don't know, but somebody who figured it out knows, and now they just basically know the right words to say. But there's some truth to that, for sure. Okay, and so compression, I think we're probably pretty good. Timing, though, we talked a little bit about timing. We're going to keep, it's like a cake. We're going to keep building layers on this today. Timing is all about, well, there's two timings, first off. If we say timing, if somebody says, oh, I want to check my timing, I might say, which timing? And you're like, what do you mean, which timing? Are you talking about cam timing? Because cam timing is when the valves open in relation to the piston, going up and down. That's cam timing. That is something that doesn't really change because we set it with a timing chain or belt and then we leave it alone. Now, that's not true when you have variable valve timing, but that system does its own thing. I'm talking about ignition timing. When does the spark plug fire? Now here you go. Spark plug fires just before the piston reaches TDC. It's normal. If the spark plug were to fire right at TDC, I picture it like this. You've all ridden a bicycle, I think. Let's say you're pedaling, right? Here's your pedaling. When your pedal comes up, you already start to, you need to start like getting ready to push down before the pedal's at the top. If you let the pedal get all the way up and you're like, oh, the pedal's at the top, then you start pushing down, it's already part way down by the time you actually catch it, and you're not really making maximum power, right? So with this, when we spark, that's going to start the combustion process. The combustion process has to actually travel. It's not instant. To your slow processing brain, it's instant. But in reality, if you were to put like a very high refresh rate and slow it down 1,000 times, you'll see the spark, you'll see the flame, and the flame will like have to travel across this distance before it reaches enough pressure where it's really going to move the piston. My point being, we got to spark it before it gets there. So timing is always what we call before top dead center. So in this case, at idle, we're about 10 degrees before top dead center. Why am I not telling you seconds? Why am I telling you degrees? Time is in seconds and minutes and stuff, right? With an engine, you can't do it like that because it depends on how many RPMs it is, right? So the faster your RPMs are, the shorter that milliseconds would be. So it's actually just better to do it in degrees. This is coming around, it's almost to TDC, about 10 degrees before top dead center, it's gonna fire the spark plug. That's what I do. Cool, so that's 10 degrees BTDC. Like it? It takes 3 milliseconds, and that's at idle for that maximum combustion pressure. If we do it just at the right time, it's almost like when you're coming around on that pedal and you're like just getting to the top and you're already pushing down, like you get a good push. It reminds me of trying to kickstart a motorcycle. If you like kind of don't know how to do it, by the time you're really kicking, it's halfway down and you don't really get it started. Like you gotta pretty much get it at top dead center and then go full force from top dead all the way to bottom and you probably start it. You look pretty cool. Otherwise you're like this. Help! Like this, like that. I know. So now when we're under high RPM, we might be talking like 20 degrees before top dead center, maybe even higher. I've seen on some stuff with aftermarket tuning like 30 degrees before top dead center. Think of what the advantage would be to do more and more advanced timing. You just get more and more of a solid push from the top. But what if you go too advanced? Piston's coming up and you go too advanced. Now your flame front is pushing down on the piston that's pushing up. That's how you blow stuff up. So it's one of those things. From the factory, you think Toyota's going to try to push to the ragged limit of what you can possibly do? No, they're going to do it pretty conservative. Be like, yeah, we're going to advance the timing, but not that much. Especially with the fuel and stuff, but not that much. So you take your car, that's factory, you bring it to a tuner, no parts installed other than exactly everything stock, the way it came from the factory. You know the tuner can most likely get more horsepower out of that car? Main reason, they're going to advance the timing. How much? I don't know. And that's part of the reason that you want it to be a Toyota uploads the factory software on all cars. You're going to want to have it be specific to that car under certain conditions. Tuner's going to go in, advance the timing a little bit, going to do some data logging on the knock sensor. If there's fuel knock and spark knock and knock because it's too advanced, they're going to see that as a voltage fluctuation on the knock sensor and be like, whoa, take some timing back, right? So generally what they'll do, add a little, no knock, add a little, No knock, add a little. Oh, it knocked, take a little out, go back to where we just were. And they'll get a few degrees out of it, and you'll get a few horsepower out of it. And then you're like, yeah, let me get a sticker of your name, let me put on my bumper. Bam, let me advertise you because you gave me a couple. And I'm like, it's not about miles per gallon, is it? It's about smiles per mile, am I right?
Smiles per mile,
Huh?
baby.
That's all your crap about timing. Cool? New cars, all computer controlled. Old car. You got old car right here. This is your distributor. You literally loosen a bolt, hook a timing light on the front, hook a clamp around cylinder number 1, spark plug number 1. Every time spark plug number 1 fires, it'll flash the light. That'll give you a good look at the crankshaft pulley with a little mark going to a little bracket that says 0, 10, 20. And it'd be like flashing. And you'd be like, all right, it's at 0. Loosen this clamp, turn it. All right, it's at 10. Give it a little extra. You know, you can adjust it literally by indexing this distributor, but you'd have to do it with the timing light, flashing light. That's old school. Then you basically, for the most part, we just set base timing like that. And then these distributors may have some mechanism, like this one has a vacuum advance. So under idle, you have a lot of vacuum. Under wide open throttle, you don't have hardly any, if any, vacuum. No vacuum would mean advance the timing because you're in it to win it, as they say, right? And then idle would be like, all right, bring it back. What happens if the timing is late? What do we call that? Is that offensive? Because I don't know. I mean, they were calling it retarded timing before the public school got hold of it. Retarded timing. All it means is it's behind schedule. That's it. So you're gonna get some offensive terms. Just wait till we talk about clutches. All right, but for now, advanced timing, retarded timing. Advanced is ahead of schedule. Retarded is behind schedule. That's it. I'm sorry. You got to know the terms. You can't handle it. All right, now, remember I just said when you're going to do that timing, you got to put it on cylinder number 1. Which one's cylinder number 1?
That one.
Shoot, I don't know. It depends on the engine. Did you know, let's say it's a 4Runner, bank 1 on the V6 is different than bank 1 on the V8? So now that I've given you that specific example, on the 4Runners back when they had the V8 as the option, you have to actually look it up. So like for example, on the front, bank 1 in this case, you always reference the engine like you're sitting on the transmission looking at it this way. Bank 1 would be the left. So if I were to roll up to this one, right, flip it up so you could recognize it. If that was true for this one here, ooh, that's a big baby. That's a big baby. All right, I don't really need this mark, but it's making me look bad. Wheel. All right, it says bank 1 is on the left from this perspective. That means I jump up here in the transmission. This is bank 1 right here. So that's the left, right? But from the front, that's the right. So in the meantime, you're trying to fix a misfire on this cylinder, and that's the wrong one the whole time it was right here. You have no idea how often. Same with O2 sensors. Bank 1 O2 sensor. People are changing, fixing, messing around with bank 2 the whole time. I didn't know. I thought bank 1 was the left. The left from what perspective? This? This. So look it up because that's going to get you the facts. Right? Bank 1. Now in this case, this is a front wheel drive. So the front of the car is this way. Cylinder 1 is actually on the back side. So you got 1, 3, and 5 on the back side of that V6. 2, 4, and 6 on the front side of that V6. Why are they like this? Well, it's not always consistent. And I'll give you an example. It's a 4-letter word that starts with F. Ford. Ford? Yes, Ford. Ford does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Why? I don't know. They do what they want. Generally speaking, I told you, 4-letter word that starts with F. I told you, but this is a little more standard. This is a Generous Motors, of course. Cylinder number 1's right here. Cylinder number 2 is right here. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That makes sense to me. It's literally from the front of the crankshaft to the back of the crankshaft, they do it like that. So, but looking from the outside, you're like, I don't know, it doesn't make sense. And Ford people are like, no way, Ford's makes the most sense. I don't know how you believe that. Okay, like I said, remember y'all have your rights to your opinions. That makes sense? Now, how do you know what engine it is though? Because I'm telling you this is a 350, but well, actually I can tell you right now, it says GM 5.7G SGT, so 5.7 is 350, I know that. It says 14093638, that's the real number. But somewhere on the engine there's going to be some sort of identification.
Stamped, right?
A lot of the new Toyota stuff has the VIN, full car VIN on it. Boom. You put that VIN number in on service lane, dealer daily, some way you put it in service information. You got all the info you need. This one, for example, has a stamp that's not the VIN number. 3UR is the engine code. And then it has a serial number that, gives you like information where it was built and stuff.
Toyotas also have an engine code on a little sticker on the hood too.
True. Yeah. So if you pop, all of them do actually. So if you pop the hood when you have the VECI label, good job, remember it from the first summer. That's going to tell you what engine it has and what emissions components, emissions family, all that type of stuff. That's absolutely right. Then if you thought the engine was swapped, you'd actually try to go find the label on the engine. But when you guys, like next week, I'm going to just point to him and be like, you go get a 2GR and do the overhaul worksheet. And be like, 2GR? 2GR? Find one that says 2GR. See what I'm saying? So if the engine's already out of the car, you can't look at the emissions label. Cool?
Yeah.
We even have 3GR, a couple of them. We got some 3UR. We got a 1UZ or maybe 2UZ. We got a bunch of stuff, no 1GRs.
No 1GR?
Just pull it out of your truck.
2GRs.
I'll do it.
We got a bunch of
The
2GRs.
gasket again.
Resealing the upper plate.
We had one, we don't anymore. That's all I'll say. So that's giving you the information on the engine. It can be in different spots though, you'll notice. Different locations, so it's a little inconsistent. Sorry for that, it's not my fault. Now let's give it a breakdown, okay? This is something that's fun because you're all Toyota geeks.
Yes.
Yep. What does it mean? Yep. Well, here you go. Design generation.
Yeah.
So 2UR, older. 3UR, newer.
Wow.
4UR, don't think it's ever coming. Because they're into the V6 now. You know what I mean?
Toyota V8 no mo.
Next, this is the family because that's the UR, right? We said the 1UR, 2UR, 3UR, that's the engine family. The 1UR is sort of like the original UR, then the 2, and then the 3. And the 2s actually tend to be a little more advanced than the 3s, but the 3s came later. They came really for the ton. Lexus was already doing 2UR stuff before that. They're doing some pretty cool stuff. And then dash, and this tells you something.
Yeah.
FE, for example. Well, that would be electronic fuel injection.
Yes.
Because the E, the F, narrow included valve train angle. What? That means, okay, it's kind of like YMCA. The valves are kind of like this. Like, kind of narrow, really. You know what I'm saying? Now, what do you guys say about the 2JZ what?
GE.
Wider.
Wow.
Valves come in like this. If you ever look at the top of a 2JZ, it's got a big old cylinder head like this big. It's huge because your valves are they're not like this, they're like a deal. Now what's the advantage? What do you think? Think of that air. You want air to go like this, or you want more air to kind of just go a little more lazy, right? Bringing it in, bringing it out, a little flatter, that's even better. I don't know, I've heard some mixed things about emissions and stuff. I think mostly the issue is those engines took up a big amount of space. It was fine with an inline, but how are you gonna do that on a V6? You have a huge head and a huge head, you got no space for that. So that's the deal with the GE. Now, we don't deal with any compressed natural gas really, but if you see a Z, you're looking supercharged. Oh, what was this one here? Your super boys in the back. Turbo. GTE. GTE. 10-second car. It's a twin turbo, a single to big turbo. Okay, so there you go. Nobody excited for the FXE?
The hybrids.
FXE.
The hybrids.
It is a hybrid, but the FXE doesn't say hybrid, it says Atkinson, and generally the Atkinson cycle makes pretty low power down low, so they go really well with the hybrid. So if it's a hybrid, it's probably gonna be Atkinson's. And then the Tacoma's Atkinson's, I don't really know why, but flex fuel direct injection. So when you start to see the S, right?
FKS.
FKS, exactly.
25.
That's what, and there's actually been a few added, I don't remember all of them right now. But that's generally, all those engine codes mean something. Go ahead.
There's flex fuel to raise.
Some of the Tundras had them on the 3URs.
I haven't seen one personally, but that sounds right.
I haven't seen them either, but I looked it up out of curiosity.
Maybe like out of state. Possibly. Cool. Alright, so like for example,
Flex fuel kits for the freeze.
how about,
I know I'm saying
alright, if I were to say the 1AZ FE, what can you tell me about that engine? Now just knowing that 1AZ, it's old school.
First generation,
One,
the engine family.
it's an AZ. So what's the difference between a 1AZ and a 2AZ?
One is newer.
Exactly, but they're both going to be AZs, right? So that's going to tell you something. And then it was a FE.
Narrow included valve and electronic fuel.
Exactly, that's it. You know everything about that engine if you can remember this. Okay, now number of cylinders, broken crank, don't worry about that. We're going to discuss something. So, believe it or not, back in the day, they used to make engines that were like 16 cylinders and stuff because you get 16 power pulses for every 2 revolutions. That would make it more smooth. A 4-cylinder would be really rough back in the day because it was like boom, boom, boom. You know, there with a 16, it's boom, 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 boom. See, so smoother. Rolls-Royce, Cadillac style. Lots of cylinders, nice and smooth. They'd have a thing, running the Rolls-Royce, you could set the cup of water on it, and you can barely even see it move on the engine, right? Like that's old school. Now, we figured out ways to make them smooth. Harmonic balancers, better engine mounts, sometimes we're using balance shafts, all this type of stuff to make the engine feel more smooth. Here's one for example. This, what would you call this engine? What's this beamer looking piece of junk? You ever notice some of those BMWs are in there crooked? The Celica's used to be that way too.
No.
Actually, the Camrys too. You put in the Camry and the whole thing's like this.
Oh yeah, they are pretty
What are
old
you
school
doing?
ones, right?
They'll slant it sometimes. It's like a slant engine.
Older Camrys like
Right?
that.
Other ones could be, you could have inlines, you could have V's, you could have opposed, right? So let's say if you were in the Subaru life, why have pistons that do this when you can have pistons that do this?
And so when the engines inevitably blow, you can shoot a piston out the fender at the car next to you.
I think so. And also when you want the spark plug, you're like, oh, way over here, gotcha.
Drop the engine,
Hide and
get spark
seek.
plugs.
You do not do that.
On the old ones, you did have to lift it up an inch.
Just a bit.
And just a bit.
This is good.
Yeah.
Loosen the motor nuts. Lift it up a bit.
And then there's some crazy stuff like a VR or a W, right? So they got engines where it's not like necessarily a V. It'd be like a W where they kind of
Oh yeah, like
they
the,
go like a W, like a Bugatti.
or like the Volkswagen stuff too.
They do. Oh, old Volkswagen VR6. Yeah.
I like the
Right?
GRC.
All sorts of stuff like that. Cool. And they can have different angles. So like 180 degrees between the cylinders would be like this. Subaru life. You could have them at a 90. This is a 90 right here. If you look at this, that's a 90. That's right at a right angle. But they can also have them more narrow, like 60. A lot of different designs like that. And the number of cylinders and the V and all that stuff really varies. So let's get a big hooray for the Subi life
Ew.
or something.
Ew.
Uh-huh. Here you got more of a narrow included V6 there.
Yes.
Generally speaking, that crankshaft's gonna be clockwise, okay? There might be some exception. Clockwise, like this. Clockwise, right from the front. They can be installed in multiple ways though, so that tends to be a little bit varied. Cool.
Yes.
Okay. Real brief on Atkinson's and Miller cycles. This is kind of advanced for the first day, but I figure if we get it early, you'll understand it better. All that discussion about displacement, displacement moves more air. When you move more air, you got to add more fuel, right? You add more fuel, you reckon your fuel economy. What if you had a hybrid engine that you wanted basically the displacement when it was important, but like when you're in hybrid mode, you don't really need that much displacement. Wouldn't it be cool to make it from a 2 liter to a 1 liter? That's hard to do. The way that Toyota did it was actually pretty smart. They're gonna open the intake valve, bring the intake down. You're gonna pull 2 liters in there. And then they're gonna start compressing and something like, nah, forget it, just leave the intake valve open. What happens to the air? Push it right back out. And then when it hits the 1 liter mark, be like, all right, close it now. Cool. So it basically wastes half its stroke, and then it only compresses the top half, and that's how you effectively make a 2 liter and a 1 liter. That's your Atkinson cycle. How the heck are they leaving the valve open that long when they want to? Variable valve timing can do that. So when you want some really aggressive Atkinson cycle VVT, you can't be using your basic VVT. These are going to be those high-speed brushless VVT motors on the front, and they're going to be really working hard to bleed off most of that compression. Now yes, it's going to have low compression. That engine's going to be pretty sluggish. Why is that okay on the hybrid?
Fuel economy.
True, but what's helping it accelerate? The electric motor is going to be like, you know what? I got you. Remember how engines are cool, but honestly they're kind of finicky? They want their little power band when they want it. Electric motor's like, give it to me. I'll take it. We'll take it all. I don't even have to be moving. You know what I'm saying? That's coming. Yeah. Miller cycle, everything I just told you about a Miller cycle is the same as Atkinson's, except the Miller cycle specifically uses a supercharger. That's it. Cool? Not that complicated, huh? Reduced pumping losses. That's what it's all about. Cool? Okay, now variable displacement. Kenny got a little bit ahead of me, but I'm here now. The way that Generous Motors did this was drastically different. They don't do Atkinson cycle stuff, partially because their V8s still have a single cam in them. So it's like, we can't do Atkinsons. We're old school.
They're still push rods, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear it? The sound of the bald eagles. Those push rods are made, forged from the bones of bald eagles.
Whoa.
Like that. Yeah.
Screaming eagles.
This right here, inspired by double cheeseburger. Right there. All right, with that being said, Generous Motors, for example, will take those V8, and it'll be like, you know what? Take cylinder, I don't know, 1, 2, 5, and 6, and just shut them down. Make my V8 into like a literal V4. I'll just fire 2, 4, 7, and 8. And how it does it, it'll either send oil to this lifter, and when it sends oil to the lifter, it kind of pumps up and locks a pin, and then it actuates the valve, or it'll bleed it off, at which point the cam will pump, and the lifter will rise on the cam like this, but it's deflated. So if it's deflated, basically the push rod moves, but the plunger is just going bloop, bloop, and the push rod's just like, doesn't do anything. So if you take a cylinder and you don't open the push rod and you don't open the valves, you know it doesn't breathe, right? Take a deep breath without opening your mouth and plug your nose. Are you okay? Yeah, it doesn't work. So basically, they'll just leave them closed. They won't actually pull air in, they won't compress it, they won't fuel it, they won't spark it, nothing.
I just wondered about like shutting down some of the cylinders. Right?
Yeah.
You have like half the engines hot and half the engines not hot.
So what they do, they alternate which ones they shut down. So I was saying, like, if they shut down 1 and 2 and 5 and 6, you still have the cylinders next door firing.
Yeah.
And they do it in such a way that the engine stays kind of balanced. Honestly, if you drove it, you wouldn't even know. You'd be freeway, getting on the freeway, and then you get up to speed and it just gets quiet, and it says V4 mode. You don't need that much power just to keep it rolling on the freeway. In those V8s, they're getting 20 miles per gallon, 22, you know, and Toyotas are like 22. So I mean, what they're doing does work. The only thing is, I gotta tell you, these lifters are failing a lot. Like, these are failing a lot. And that's not a small job. Those lifters are under the head. So you're bringing them in, pulling the head, and doing all the lifters. Like, that's part of the reason I like my Hummer. My Hummer was before what they call this DOD, Displacement on Demand, or Active Fuel Management. Mine was pre all that stuff. So like, I got the oldest. Let me put it this way. I got the newest of the old school. So mine has none of that. Also really bad on gas, and I hate it. Sometimes I think this sucks, but then when I talk with someone like, oh yeah, my lifter just blew up. It was $4,000 to fix it. I'm like, this is great. So it just kind of depends on the perspective. So the domestics are doing this. You may get a few basic questions about displacement on demand. Pump the lifter up, it actuates the push rod. Don't pump the lifter up, it don't actuate the push rod, which means it doesn't actuate the rocker and the valve. And I do have pictures of that coming. Cool, so in fact, we can use this one right here. This is an active fuel management lifter. It's huge, it's complicated. There's a lot of stuff happening there because it's doing more than normal. This displacement on demand one did show you a pretty cool image, right? You can see your cam right here. As your cam rolls around, it either lifts the rocker, or it either lifts the lifter, or it doesn't. So right now it's on the point, so it lifts this lifter, which pushes on the push rod. The push rod pushes on the rocker has a pivot, and pushes down. When it pushes down, it opens up the valve. That's push rod valve train right there. ASE will not call it push rod engine. They won't call it push rod valve train. They will call it OHV. Why?
Overhead valve.
Exactly. But Toyota's valves are overhead, so why overhead valve? Toyota's valves are overhead, but so is the cam, see? So it's an overhead valve, but the cam is nowhere overhead. The cam is in the block. So they're specifying OHV means only the valves are overhead, whereas if it's a Toyota, like that one, overhead cam, valve, everything's overhead. You see OHV, you picture push rods. I'd go ahead.
I think we kind of passed it a little ago, but about the crankshaft, how I hear sometimes like performance switches that have like flat plane crank.
Actually, the cross plane crank and the flat plane crank is a really fun concept, but it's an assignment later, so I don't want to spoil it.
Okay.
You're going to do an assignment on cross plane, flat plane, see the differences. You're going to hear the differences. You can tell them what your preference is. That'd be a cool one. Okay, now let's go short block, long block. So let's say a car comes in and it's got engine problems, you need to fix it. If you sell a short block, what are you getting? Yeah, it's basically going to be the block. The crankshaft will be in it. All the bearings will be set. The pistons, rods will be in it. The piston rings are compressed. We call that the rotating assembly. Right? The crank, rods, pistons, all the bearings, all that stuff, that's kind of the technical part. That's the part that's like, you got to really know what you're doing. Make sense? You get a short block, it shows up basically assembled, and you're like, oh, okay. I clean, I put on the head gasket, which I have here. I put on the head gasket like this right here.
Wow.
I put the heads on, I torque the heads. I mean, it's still a little technical to change the heads over, but like, the tricky part is really the bottom end, getting all that set up. Head gasket, as an example, below that being the bottom end. If you notice, the head gasket's got the flame rings right here, got holes for where the bolts go, got holes for where coolant goes, got holes for where coolant goes, oil goes. So this head gasket's an important part, and I'll tell you firsthand, I don't just try to make myself look smart. When I do dumb stuff, I'll tell you. I did a V6 at one point, and I was trying to rush, make hours. I put it all together, and I started up, and it had a massive oil leak. Like all the oil was out of it within 60 seconds. I'm like, what the heck? It's got to be an oil filter. I look, the oil filter's fine. I'm like, what? And I look, and I put oil in it again. I start again. It's just blowing out from the head to the block. I'm like, something's wrong. I wanted to say like it was the machine shop or something, because I got a short block, and it was for oil consumption, which I'll tell you more about later. But I sent the heads out to the machine shop, I want to blame them. What do you think happened?
You didn't move your head gasket.
Okay, there's a left and a right. And everything, I laid it on there like, yep, it looks good. The difference was one of them had a hole for the oil in one spot and one of them had it in another spot. So when I bolted it up, there was really like a passage going just out to nothing. And it puked all the oil, so I had to do it again. The head gaskets are one-time use. So not only have to do it again, I had to get new gaskets. Oh, and the bolts are torqued to yield.
Oh.
So I was like, hey, I messed up and I'm gonna be down for a whole nother day without pay because it's flat rate. You don't get paid the second time when you screw it up, right? So I felt the pain, but also I need to order a whole nother set of bolts for 2 heads and another 2 head gaskets. Sorry. You know, so I'm just saying, it looks pretty easy, but somewhere on there, it may say left, right, bank 1, bank 2, somewhere. So like, take it from me firsthand, slow down, make sure you got the right one in the right spot. Colin, go ahead.
What do they mean when people say they have like, oh, I bought a short block engine or I bought a long block engine?
Okay, that's the next point. So short block replacement, as you can see, that's the rotating assembly. Long block includes short block plus the heads.
Oh, yeah. You should be replacing.
Valve train, can, tongue chain, everything, right? So it's not to say it's a whole engine, but you got your short block, probably got a valve cover. You got your heads already torqued, not put on backwards. Doesn't need to get a second set of torque yield bolts, right? All that stuff's assembled. What you're putting on a long block, probably gonna put the intake and exhaust manifolds on it. You know, some bolt-on stuff, and then it's ready to be installed. It's a lot less work to do a long block than it is to do a short block. It's a lot less work even to get an entire replacement engine, but most of the time, a replacement engine is probably going to be used, in which case it's going to come like complete. Like this would be a used engine. They'd be like, yeah, we got the distributor, the throttle body, and everything. If you want to do a brand new engine, or you know, a used engine, you can, basically. If you put this on, and let's say you put this on and you end up finding out that this throttle body has a leak, you're probably not going to get paid to fix that. You know why? When you put an engine in, it's expected that, you know, you're changing parts over. So I've got some junkyard engines been like, man, I could swing that whole thing in right now and save myself a couple hours of swapping. But if I put it in and that sensor's bad, or this thing is bad, see, now the customer's not going to pay for that. Because the engine I took out, I knew all that stuff was good, so I really should swap those parts onto it. So if you're going to do a new engine, either way, you're still going to have to get valve cover gaskets, or at least intake gaskets and exhaust manifold gaskets and stuff. So that kind of depends. Kind of make sense? You like it? All right, and most of those will have a core charge, by the way. You guys know what a core charge is?
Return the old part
All right, so why are we going to return this stuff?
so they can
Rebuild it.
or
Somebody else is going to rebuild it. It's probably not going to happen in the U.S. You know why? You're too expensive. You're too expensive. I'm too expensive too, but you're too expensive too. So if they can rebuild an engine for somebody who's making $15 a day, and they can do an engine in a day, they're paying $15. You guys want to work for $15 a day?
not really.
There's people only a few hours from here who work for $15 a day. Yeah, right, I know. That's what the other, me Ocho amigo Rene.
But the LK2 engine I got was remanufactured.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I'm not even being I'm not being racist. I'm just telling you. I talked with the homie and I said, you know, the homie, I pay him $160 a day, and I said, like, why not go back with your whole family? I make $15 a day there, and there's not work every day. So he might only get 3 days a week at $15 a day, $45 a week. So yeah, your parts, trust me, they're gonna get rebuilt, but they're not gonna be rebuilt in Garden Grove. They're not gonna be rebuilt in Anaheim. They're gonna be rebuilt in TJ, or maybe a little further south.
My opinion was rebuilt in Mexico.
Yeah, because they got a good labor force, and they don't. The problem is, if you guys make work for $15 a day, that doesn't even cover the cafeteria food that you got. So it's just everything costs you. How do you understand? There's good opportunities here, and everything is great. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just letting you know. Maybe when I retire, though, we'll see. But you just it's too expensive to live here to be able to pay what's the minimum wage now? 16? It depends on, I think, the county.
Yeah.
If it's
But,
McDonald's, it's 20.
either way, we're 16, 18, you may even say 20 for fast food. Not when they can pay $2 an hour, okay? So there is rebuilding occurring in other places. You're too expensive, and that whole thing is part of the reason why we don't generally do rebuilds. That's the point. Customer states they have an engine concern. If you find it has an internal engine problem, it's getting an engine in the dealership. Imagine how much you would do it for. What's your dealer rate? Who knows their number? 175, 200, and I'm pretty sure we got some people 225 here.
Actually, ours is 220,
All
I
right, $220 an hour, and an overhaul pays 22 hours. You just can't do that. The numbers don't make sense, right? The dealer's not in business to do overhauls. The dealer's going to be in business to yank that piece of crap out, put a less piece of crap in there. You're going to get your 12 hours to do engine R&R, and that engine is going to get sent out someplace else, okay? So this class is going to be a lot about rebuilding. However, in reality, you're going to be replacing. There's going to be some exceptions though. And this has happened, if somebody, let's say a T10 student, leaves an oil filter loose and a whatever, and the engine blows up, the dealer may have someone rebuild that in-house. And I want you to be to the level where you can do that. They may have a used car that goes sideways. They may have, I was doing work when I was at one of the dealers, I'll let them remain unnamed. They did a rebuild on there was a problem with the head, and they redid the heads. When they put the valve guide seals on, they didn't have a keeper on. It dropped the valve and nuked the piston down there, totally grenaded it. So they're like, no problem, you're not fired, but you'll be fixing that one. Now when the dealer's gonna, because you guys have it pretty good, okay? And it's a love-hate relationship. But when I came up, there was no guarantee. Okay, so if I flagged an hour, I got paid an hour. The dealer can't do that. You understand that, right? They already got sued. So if the dealer has to pay you your clock time, and they're telling you, hey, you got to fix that engine, the dealer's losing some money to fix that engine, just letting you know. They don't want to lose any more than they have to. They may have you fix that engine like a rebuild. Some of you may encounter rebuilds, I'm just saying. Would it be for a typical customer? Probably not. Back in the day when the 2 AZs were burning oil, customers come in and they could get free pistons and rings as part of a campaign for oil consumption, but it was recommended that they're offered the ability to do main bearings and rod bearings. And a lot of techs had never done it, right? So I don't want you to be like, we don't do rebuilds, I don't want to do rebuilds, don't even talk about a rebuild, okay? I'm saying, generally you're not going to do it, but you might, especially when something goes wrong. And it will.
All those times.
All right, so those are the parts. Now just talking about the major block components, you guys, to summarize, you've seen this. Pistons and rods, the block, the crank, and then also balance shafts, which you can add a little bit more in. So that's your whole block and bottom end. A couple cool things. Remember we talked about those cross hatching a little bit? There's our cross hatches. Those are cut into the liner. The liner on most Toyotas is called a thin spiny liner. We got an aluminum block, and we basically inject a high temperature steel into it to give it a hardening right there. And the piston goes up and down on that thin spiny liner. If you have any sort of a problem in this that would require boring, there's nothing to bore. We did it, I think once we cut like 6/1000ths and we were into the aluminum. So there is no boring on most of these Toyotas. If you got a problem with the block, add a round, taper, whatever, it's getting a new block. If it's getting a new block, it's probably getting a short block. If it's getting a short block, you may want to consider a long block, right? Because now you're talking about redoing this bottom end, but in the meantime, you got a bunch of wear on the heads and the valves, and so like what they made me do when the car was under warranty for oil consumption, they're like, we'll pay for a short block or a long block. We'll pay for a short block or heads. Which one is it? And I had a really good explanation as to why it was both. On hard acceleration, it would blow clouds of smoke out, and that's really generally bottom end, right? So did a compression test, it was decent, did a wet compression test, it came way up, like, hey, that's bottom end wear. All right, cool, so it's a short block. I said, yeah, but here's the thing. If I leave the car sitting overnight and I come start it in the morning, I get a big puff of smoke. And that's very indicative, like it really means valve stem or valve guide seals. So I'm more saying like it really needs the top end, but it really needs the bottom end too. It's both. And they fought me on it pretty bad. And I had to get tasks and I had to talk with the DSPM and everything. And ultimately, that's what I explained. He said, all right, I'll tell you what we're going to do. You get a short block, and you can take those heads, and you can send them to a machine shop and have them redone. And that's what we did. And that's the one I put the head gasket on backwards. And after that, though, it was sweet. No more oil consumption or anything, right? So these cross-hatching, again, are a clue, but that's an important part for the rings. This also shows the water jackets. Here's your connecting rod, like we kind of talked about, a little summary. Rod bearings. The rod, the piston. These pistons are probably hypereutectic, which means hypereutectic is sort of like in between a forged and a cast. It's a type of cast, but it's pretty hard, and they put this nice, like it's almost like a non-stick pan coating on them, like you buy those non-stick. I don't know if it's Teflon, it's a couple different things, but it's like Teflon at least, yeah. Here's your rings, compression ring, second compression ring, and the oil scraper ring. So those are all on there. Cool, as an overview. Now in the piston, we have these ring lands, and that's what's gonna support those rings. But also we have a drainage hole, so the oil that gets scraped as the piston comes down, it's gonna scrape it up, hit the oil ring, go in and go down that return hole. A lot of times that's how we lubricate that wrist pin. Right, so if we got an engine, and let's just say like mine, you can tell a lot of carbon and stuff, a lot of miles, those oil ring holes can get clogged. And next thing you know, it's leading to oil consumption. By the way, that's why the two AZs had the campaign. And then also it tends to leave the wrist pin dry. If the wrist pin gets dry, it'll wear, it'll fail. You tend to get a double knock. Not like knock, 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 more like a knock, 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 knock. That's indication of a piston pin. And then you can see there's some action on the rings as it goes up and down. There's your rods, different types of rods. Sometimes they have a bushing. Otherwise, this is that rod bearing we talked about. They may have tangs to help them not spin. One of the things you read in the book, when you do this overhaul work, which you're going to be starting to do maybe as soon as tomorrow, but definitely next week, you do not, under any circumstances at all, ever, even if the form says so, put oil on the back side of the bearings. Those bearings need to have friction to the rod. We want no friction on the inside. We want all friction on the outside because we do not want it to spin. I found it referenced in another book too. So if you got oil on the back side of that, they actually say discard the bearing. They don't even say clean it. They say junk it.
Wow.
So they're pretty intense. Go ahead.
What's the best way to clean the main surfaces before putting it together?
Good question. So if a lot of the stuff they say on like in the service manual, it's a lot of soapy water, but actually brake clean's good. Brake clean would be good. Parts, I don't know if I'd use Simple Green. It's kind of, the problem with soapy water and Simple Green, it's all water based, and if you spray it and you wipe it and you put on, it's fine, but if there's water left over and it sits out, it starts to corrode and rust and stuff. So brake clean would actually be good. Brake clean the surface of the block, but not necessarily the bearing. Just keep the bearing clean and right in there, boom. And then lubricate the right side of it. When we do bottom end, we'll do some demos on all of that.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So you can see quite a bit of things. On that crank, you see we've got counterweights, and that's to balance, offset the piston and connecting rod. So this crankshaft would be balanced, right? This whole crankshaft would be balanced, and each of these pistons and rods should weigh the same. So from the factory, it's all balanced. They don't like, you know, if you want to do some really custom stuff, you can actually have it balanced where they're going to drill a little, they don't add weights to this. They'll actually remove weight from either the counterweights or possibly from somewhere on the piston. So they're going to be balanced from the factory. If you start getting into big time machining, you might actually have to have it rebalanced. Here's that crank pin. So this is this would be your flat plane. and this is a cross plane. And for a V6, V6s are just like this. They're kind of different. It's not really cross or flat.
Nice.
Okay, we're gonna come back on that one. Here's your bearings. Note it has oil feed holes, so when you do the overhaul, you have to make sure these holes are lined up with the holes from the block. If you block those holes off, that rebuild is gonna last like a day. Don't ask me how I know, but just trust me, all right? Just trust me. All right, cool. As we continue, you got balance shafts that they add. The balance shafts, basically, if you have an engine that's out of balance, the balance shaft will have an equal but opposite weight. So if your engine is kind of out of balance and throwing upward, the balance shaft will be throwing the same amount of force downward, so the net is nothing. It's like noise cancellation, except it's vibration cancellation. And remember, those need to be timed. So when you're setting up the camshaft timing, you also need to set up balance shaft timing. Okay, and then there's your head. So breaking down the head just a little bit. This is your head. Sometimes they have a camshaft sub-housing assembly, which some people will call a cam tower. That's what the cam actually rides in. A lot of times there's FIPG right here, and it can leak, by the way. So if you have to do cam towers, that's a big job. That job's no joke. You're pulling the cams and the timing chains and all that stuff out. That one's rough. Right, so the cam's going to ride in there. The cam has their own caps. Cams have sprockets, which may or may not be VVT actuators as well, on the head gasket. And then you can see more into the head itself. We got intake and exhaust valves. Those will ride in a bushing. So when this valve goes up and down, a bushing supports it. That's the valve guide, or in this case, the valve guide bush, but I don't know why Toyota calls it that. Bushing would be more normal. Valve guide bushing supports it. When your valve stem wears, your valve guide can wear. Next thing you know, your valve is kind of sloppy. You have a valve guide seal that's supposed to seal oil from leaking down in there. That's why I sent the heads to the machine shop. Because if the valve guides are loose, you're going to put a new seal on and it's going to do this. That's not going to seal the oil. And the oil is going to drip down the stem, one drop at a time, all night long, and it end up with a puddle on the piston. You're going to start it, it's going to get a big blue cloud. Right? So that's one of the ways to diagnose valve guide seals. But if it's leaking, you don't know for sure if it's a valve guide seal that's brittle and kind of crusty and worn out, or maybe the valve stem is worn, maybe the bushing is worn. Now, you tell me, how, if you're rebuilding the engine, how would you know which one's wrong? Which one's getting valve seals, or is it getting valve guides and bushings and valve stems and what?
Should we do it all together?
Okay, that's one way, but in the interest of capitalism and stuff, you don't want to just be like, oh yeah, you just need everything. Because if somebody can come in and undercut you and be like, hey, you don't need new heads, you actually just need new valve guide seals. See, now they're doing it cheaper and just as good a quality. So if you don't know, if you're like this, like, I don't know, I don't see, I don't measure, I don't look, do it all. But to try to be more efficient, to try to be more thorough, you're going to take these valves out, you're going to measure them, multiple points, this way. Then if I measure it this way, right, that's out around. You can measure taper. Guess what? There's specs for all that. If it's in spec, what's up?
Good.
Good to go. Exactly. Good to go because you think so? No. Good to go because the service manual says so, right? So like, I function pretty well in the automotive environment because a lot of it's not really a matter of opinion. I really struggle with opinions. Opinions are like, I'm pretty stubborn and I'm pretty damn sure I'm right. But everybody's got a right to their opinion. They're like butts. Everybody has one and a lot of them stink. You know what I'm saying? All right? However, we got to respect them. No. Service manual has the numbers. You measure, you compare to TIS. TIS says yes, it's a yes. Don't care about opinions. You measure, TIS says no, it needs it. Don't care about opinions. See, isn't that nice? I like that. I like that. So there's specs for that. Now, if you're doing a rebuild, you get new seals. 100%. Remember I said seals and gaskets, right? But does it need new valves? I don't know. We got to measure them. Does it need the head sent out to do new valve guides? I don't know. We got to measure it. So we can not only measure the valve, we can actually take this head, which I'm going to stand up right here, and I'll show you this. I'm going to pop this apart. I pulled the keepers out earlier. This is the top valve retainer. I'm gonna pull the spring, right? By the way, does it need a spring? I don't know, there's a tool to measure it. You can actually compress the spring and measure how much tension it makes. How many pounds did you have to apply to get it to drop 10 millimeters? You can measure we got the tool for that. And then I'll tip this head up. It's a big boy, right? And then I can pop this valve out, and I can actually pop the seal out, and I could measure the hole in there. I could measure the hole for wear. That is the guide. So I'd be measuring the guide. Is the guide good? Is the guide bad? If it's supposed to have, let's say, a 3 millimeter guide and a let's make it a 300 thousandths guide and a 297 thousandths valve stem, I can measure that. If the clearance is too much, like maybe the guide is 310 thousandths and the valve stem is 295 thousandths, that'd be like 15 thousandths clearance. That's going to be too sloppy. That means I need to get a new valve, and I probably also need to get guides pressed in the head or get a new head, right? As a matter of fact, it's not like a guess. See what I'm saying? So you can measure both, but then additionally you'll see the valve also has a spot that's called the seat, and that's where the seat is actually, the valve is going to sit on the seat. What I could do is I could put a paste on here called Prussian blue and then go like this, ready? And then pull it out. And then look, did it contact all the way around? If there's a defect, if there's a bend, if there's some burning, if there's some pitting, the Prussian blue would leave like a spot where it didn't contact. That would mean I need to resurface this, cut it, lap it. You know, there's a couple different fixes potentially.
I was gonna say, I've heard people replace it with valve.
You can, but on this one, I don't think you can. It looks integral. You know what? No, this one's integral. So on some, like especially on race car stuff, you can actually drive a valve seat out, put a new valve seat in, stake it, or sometimes even do a little spot weld, possibly. Other times, like on this one, it makes sense. This is actually an iron head, so I should have known it was integral. On an iron head, there is no seat. The seat is cut into the iron. So we could take it over the machine and cut a new seat. It's just like refinishing.
Could you weld onto it and then?
A machine shop could potentially do that. That's like advanced level repair. We don't really normally recommend that. But yeah, there's like remember what I was saying, the minimum is, you guys know how to tell if it's good or bad. The limit would be, you figure out how to do these TIG welding and all this stuff and remachine it, you could go nuts. And at that point, I need to just sit down. You can teach the class. And you could do that. That's not the direction I'm really going. So you could be the race engine builder for, I don't know, TRD or something. It'd be cool. Cool, so that's a little bit about the head. Valve train, for example, you can see crank, chain, cams. Dual overhead cam, go into 4 rocker arms, have these little lifters, they'll call hydraulic lash adjuster. That keeps them pumped up. Cool. So do we really need to do an adjustment here? No. No, they're set from the factory. We don't do valve adjustments on Camrys. When the last time you did a valve adjustment on Toyota? If you did, it was old. Toyota's kind of gone away from that. The hydraulic lash adjuster pumps it up and it stays pretty tight, right? 2JZ, you don't have that. Subaru, ooh, maybe not. Go ahead.
I heard that Honda's do a lot of valve adjustment.
They do. Hondas don't use, because they don't use hydraulic lash adjusters. Like these are lash adjusters, they're not lifters, because if you look, the cam is actually pushing on a rocker. There is no lifter, but over here it's a lash adjuster. It pushes on the backside of the rocker and it keeps it tight, like kind of pumped up. So this is maintenance free right there. Oil changes, no valve adjustment needed. Honda, that'll actually have a stud with a flathead screwdriver spot and a nut and no hydraulic lash adjuster. You gotta adjust those.
How often do they recommend to adjust them?
Check the service manual. I think it's like 30 or 60K. Yeah, you're probably over. You can do it. Anybody got your junky Hondas? All those things. We'll pull them all in later.
Oh, yeah.
Like later in the semester, for real. You can do it. I'll give you credit. So you go, there's your cam. Here's the camshaft operation. I think you guys can see. Little basics on cam. 2 things you need to know about cams. Lift and duration. Lift means how much it opens the valve. Duration means how long it opened the valve for. Lift is basically simple. You actually measure the small part of the cam, and let's say this was 500 thousandths, and then you measure the big part of the cam, and that's 600 thousandths. What's the difference between 500 and 600? 100 thousandths. So that cam's got 100 thousandths lift. See how I figured it out? Or if you wanted, you could put a dial indicator on there and spin it and be like zero it out right here and then turn it. And then when it gets to the high point, you'd measure 100 thousandths on the dial indicator, but you can just do it with a micrometer. I realized I'm leaving fingerprints all over. Okay, so a couple ways to do it. Now the duration, you have to measure how many degrees it's off of its base circle. Cool, kind of get it? We'll cover this one more time, by the way. But I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, so I want you to be prepared for this week. All right, this one's got the lash adjuster, see that? Automatic adjustment. This one doesn't. This one needs to be adjusted, but do you see an adjustment? It's because there's a shim right here. If that needs to be adjusted, you have to pull the bucket off and you have to change the shim. Or if you're a machine shop, you could actually cut the valve here or cut the seat down here. But machine shops can do the valve adjustment without new shims. You, at the dealership, you're going to need shims if you're going to do that one. Here's your timing chain. Timing chain needs a tensioner. Tensioner is going to keep it tight. Right? Cool. How often do timing chains need to be done?
Not very often.
Timing chain is going to be good for the lifetime of the engine, generally speaking. Now, if something goes wrong, maybe not. Some cars do have some timing chain problems, but generally speaking, you don't go in there to do a timing chain. If you're doing a head gasket and you're taking the timing chain off, might you want to put a new one on? Yeah, I'll give you that. What was your question, Brandon?
What about Audi? Because they have a 100,000 service for time gasket.
That may be. I don't even like those cars anyway. But timing belts, different story. Timing belts have a maintenance interval. 60K, maybe 90K. I've seen them as high as 105. The service manual calls for that belt to be done. You're doing a belt. You won't find a service interval, generally speaking, except for that Audi apparently, for a timing chain. The marks, we're going to go over the marks and stuff when you do it. But setting up timing chains is a little tricky. There's that belt. This is the one that would need periodic replacement per the service manual. Cool. You guys have all seen oil pan, right? Should be pretty familiar. There's a structural oil pan. See how that one's aluminum, a little more beefy. Notice it's on aluminum block. This oil pan adds rigidity to that aluminum block because it's aluminum, so it's, cast iron is a little more strong in a way. Right, and then this one has actually a structural pan, upper oil pan, and then the lower stamped steel one. This is an easy job, and this one's a little more tough. Anybody ever seen one of these messed up? I have. There was somebody who tried to get an oil filter cover off, and they hit so hard the ratchet actually broke through the structural pan.
Whoa.
Didn't they do
I'm
that
just
with one of
saying.
the Lexuses? Remember when Eddie?
That was different. That was
Just saying, okay? So we talked quite a bit about the head. I think you're probably pretty good. Probably okay on cams.
Yes.
Right? Okay. Here's old school. Right? Cam and block. Here's a little bit newer school. Cam is in the head, pushing on rock arms, pushing on valves. Those are the two different styles. Cool. Now valves, we'll go in a little more detail next time, but just making sure you're all set. The valve, the spring, retainer, and these little suckers right here. Remember that one I told you they dropped the valve? Because one of those keepers wasn't all the way in its groove? So when we do heads, I'm going to give you some tips and say like, smack it with the mallet. You're going to be like, I don't want to do that. Okay. If the people were to have smacked it with a mallet, that keeper would have flown off and they'd have been like, oh my gosh, this engine would have blown up. But they didn't. They started it and then it did blow up. There's a reason why I'm saying this stupid stuff. Like, if those keepers are not in right, that valve, they'll end up flying off and the valve will end up falling into the cylinder and the pistons will be like, valve, my favorite, nom, nom, nom.
Oh, is that what they did?
Boom. It was rough. That's what well, bend, sure, but if the valve falls all the way in there, it ain't coming back out. It's just gonna be, it's gonna be like a grenade in there. It's gonna be nuts. All right, scavenging we talked about a little bit. Cool, like scavenging is where we purposely play with the valve timing so that the outgoing exhaust can kind of like make a negative pressure and pull fresh air in. You get even closer to that volumetric efficiency of 100%. Here's an old school, this is an L head. The valves were actually in the block. The cam was down there and the valves were down there. This is like Briggs and Stratton style. But you know what engine had this? Next time you guys watch Iron Man, do me a favor. You'll notice when he's working on this hot rod in his garage and he's got, what's the bot's name? Winston or something? Jarvis. Pull up this diagram of the Ford Flathead. Like, it was cool, but it was sort of like, dude, you're working on like the most easy engine ever made. You know, but it was still cool. But it was a flathead. They had a big flat head right here, and that was it. There's no cam, there's no valves, there's no nothing in the flathead because the valves are in the block. It's pretty cool. Old school though. Not real good for maximum power, but they did sound pretty good. Right, so this gets into this is a roller, and this is a flat tappet. This rolls across the cam, this slides across the cam. This is better generally. This one was fine, but that oil would have to have high levels of zinc, so we've mostly done away with that. But back in the day, the old oil had zinc and stuff in it, so like old engines, you might have to run special oil because they don't have rollers on there, and they'll slide across the cam and wear it out. Cool, so we'll get a little bit more into the rock arms, but here's that Honda style adjustment. Loosen the nut, tighten the clearance, loosen the clearance, set it, tighten it back up, periodically. This one, don't have to worry about it. Set it once. Basically, you get the push rod, right? And the push rod's loose and you tighten it up till it's not loose. And then you turn it like another half a turn or something, quarter, half a turn, then you're done. Just getting a preload on the push rod, plunging it a little bit, and then the lifter does the rest. Cool, so it's pretty nice. Timing chains, like some of them are complex and some are simple. This is the most simple one you ever get. You make this dot line up with that dot. You could do that, but on a lot of them there's going to be multiple dots and marks and things, and they can be pretty complex. Then we talk a little bit about valve timing. That's when they open and close. So the cam controls that, right? But variable valve timing will ultimately change the cam with relation to the sprocket, and it can advance it, it can retard it. It can do it on one, the intake, it can do it on the exhaust, it can do it on both, it can do a little bit, it can do a lot of it. So VVT is a whole subject on its own that you do a discussion on actually. This is a pretty good shot of VVT using a phaser. This solenoid gets a signal from the ECM, and the ECM controls the solenoid, which controls oil, which advances or retards it. Sorry, offensive terms. And here's how it looks, right? So the center has the actual cam, the outside has the sprockets. If we send oil on this side, it'll advance the cam without moving the chain. It'll advance the actual cam within the housing. If we send oil on this side, it'll retard it. So it's oil this way or oil this way, and that's how it's fine-tuning it. How does it know where the advance or retarded is? How does it know where the timing is? Give you a clue, it's right here. Yeah, right there. It's the cam position sensor. We use that. That's what that's there for. Cool, so a couple different types. They can look like this. Some of the newer ones can be electric, like I was saying. There's some more complex timing stuff. You're gonna do worse than that, believe me. All right, pretty cool. Now, two differences. Who's heard of interference engine? Help me understand what's that mean?
Isn't that when the valve and the piston?
If they're in time, it never happens. Okay, and that's why we have timing belts and chains, and we make sure stuff is right. But if they're out of time and the valve's open when the piston happens to be on TDC, the piston may kiss the valve. These recesses are generally just because it with a little bit of float and a lot of VVT they can get close. This is not enough to make it so they won't touch though. A lot of new engines are interference engines. Old engines weren't because they're running that 8-to-1 compression. New engines are 10.5 to 1. They're going to be way up there, and the valves are big and like, trust me, you're going to know. You're going to find out. You're going to find out. Right, so the difference between push rods and overhead cam, I think you guys got it?
Yeah.
Push rod, cam in the block, push rods actuate the rock arms. Overhead cam, eliminate a lot of that stuff. Get the cam way up on top. Well, that's a little more new. And the manifold we talked about quite a bit. And then manifolds on new stuff are generally going to be plastic now because we no longer have fuel in there, so we can go plastic. It's lighter, it's cheaper. We're injecting the fuel right at the port. You couldn't do that in the carbureted stuff. This might actually have an aluminum intake on the lower. So like down here, if you have port injectors, they're not probably going to be in plastic. They're going to be in aluminum. So you have an aluminum lower and a plastic upper or plenum. Pretty common. Exhaust manifolds, like we were saying. So like this is a nice big cast iron manifold. This one's a tubular, but you know what? That's looking a lot like a header. So they won't call it a header, but like this one is big cast form, and this one's like little pieces that are welded, like tubes. Like a header is like if you were to fabricate your own pipes and weld them together, that'd be a header. They used to do it. That was cool back in the day. Right, and so now we're going to switch gears just a little because this is not so much about the engine parts. We're pretty much there on that. This is more about what your service is going to look like. This is a busy semester, you know that.
Yep.
You got a lot of stuff to do. So talking about engine sealing, here we've got intake manifold gasket, for example, a head cover, which we'll call a valve cover gasket, head gaskets. They could be made of silicone, metal, cork, felt, fiberglass, polymer, butyl rubber, neoprene. They're all going to be different, and the way we handle them is different. So the way we install gaskets, we don't just do what we thought. You know what I'm saying? How are you going to know the specific procedures how to do it?
Service information.
Bingo. So if I give you a job as simple as replace a valve cover gasket, even if you've done it on something, you're going to follow TIS. It's going to talk about where to put FIPG. It's going to talk about how to prep it, how to handle it, how to clean it, all that type of stuff. How much FIPG and what locations, right? So we're going to tie it pretty tight to service info. If you ever have something come back and they're like, hey, you messed this up, why did you put FIPG all over that head gasket? You'd be like, well, my grandpappy told me more FIPG is better or something. Like that's not your answer. And if they ask me, like, what the heck are you teaching them? You know what I'm gonna say? TIS. TIS really is like, that's really your source right there. It's not like what you think and what the guy next to you and whoever, see what I'm saying? So this is gonna give you some samples, some examples. Basically, gaskets are non-moving parts, so like two parts that bolt together, that's gonna be a gasket. If it's a moving shaft or something, that's probably gonna be a rubber seal. Gaskets tend to be a little easier. Seals you need to do a driver and stuff, they can be a little tricky. So like for example, here's installing a seal. If you go to install this seal, it's really easy to mess that up. They probably have an SST. Do I have the SST? I probably don't have the SST. The problem is I don't do a lot of repeat stuff here. And for the engines you guys will be doing, I'm sort of going to show you like, you know, how you can, we could try to find the SST, but a lot of people in the shop are going to use like a socket and that type of stuff. In that way, like using the socket, if you drive it straight, you're good to go. I wouldn't say to add a bunch of FIPG to it, but like to use the SST is great if you can find one. So, just saying. For some rear mains though, I do have the SST because rear mains can be a real pain in the butt. Here's for example the FIPG, Toyota seal packing. One of these may be for oil, one of these may be for coolant. You know, there's different FIPGs for different parts. All right, so service info would say that. Additionally here, they're talking about how to do prep work. So there's some videos on how to prep it. You do have to have it really clean. When I did one of my first reseals, I didn't realize how important it was to have no oil. And when I went to put the part back on, a little oil streak ran across. And when I put it on, it was interesting. The FIPG just kind of squirmed around and like never set up. And it ended up being a huge leak and I had to do the job 2 times. Second time didn't pay, right? So a lot of the stories are firsthand me having to pay the price. When you have to do a job twice and you only got paid to do it once, you remember it. Okay, that's kind of how that works. So the prep is important, and then they're talking about usually between 2 and 4 millimeters, but sometimes it can be thicker. They'll tell you, TIS will tell you, 2 millimeters here, 4 millimeters here. Go around the hole this way, go around both. It'll specify. If you're following TIS, you're really generally not going to have a problem. If you're making it up and you do have a problem, you know, imagine how that potential court trial would go. On or about August 25th, did you or did you not disregard what service information said and use the incorrect amount of Toyota seal packing material on this engine? Yes. Why did you not follow the service information? Because I thought I knew better. You just look stupid. So pretty much follow what TIS says in those things. Now, if TIS says pull the engine and the transmission together to get the engine out, you can be smarter than that. But to start changing the quantities of sealant and stuff, no. All right, dye penetrant, this is how we're going to look for cracks. We got a whole lesson on that. Plastic gauge is something you're going to experience. This actually measures oil clearance. It's kind of like pancakes. Who likes thin pancakes? And who likes thick pancakes? Thin pancakes? Crepes? You got to raise them. Crepes. Okay, thick pancakes? Okay, winners? All right, now think about this. If you had a specific amount of batter and you put it in the pan and you push down a little bit on the spatula, that's how you get the thick ones, right? Make sense? What if you put the same amount of batter and you push the spatula down or whatever you cook it with? Down, 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 down. What do you get? Thin, but it gets bigger, right? Same with plastic gauge. You put in this little tiny strip, it looks like dental floss. And if you bolt the cap up and it smears a little bit, that's like a pretty big oil clearance. But if it smears to like a big thin pancake, that means there wasn't much clearance between the cap and the cam, or the cap and the crank, right? So the bigger smear, that means the tighter the oil clearance was. There's a spec. This one would be good. This one's reading about 1.5 thousandths. Perfect. That's one of the final things we do to make sure the clearance between our crank and our bearings are good, our cam and our bearings. So it's literally just a plastic gauge, and it's coined and patented, branded plastic gauge. And if we're fixing up threads, we could use a thread chaser or a tap potentially. Now, when we get into measurement, this is something that we're going to do slightly different, but I'm just going to introduce to you to some of the tools right now, and then we're going to do some actual measurement probably tomorrow. All right, so vernier calipers, not my favorite tool, but using the vernier scale, you can see using this number, we're past 2 centimeters. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we got the 2.4, but it's a little more than that. So you just look for the one that lines up, which happens to be a 0.07. 2.4 plus 0.07, 2.47. All right, just as a baseline. Again, I don't really like those. I prefer dial caliper, but also micrometers. So if you wanted to measure, let's say, this camshaft journals, don't bust out that caliper. That's not precise enough. We're going micrometer, 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 micrometer. So I brought out a whole set. You will all be doing tons of precision measurement. So everybody's got access to a bunch of different micrometers. When you're doing the actual engine teardown, measurement, and reinstallation, take your time. Don't just try to knock out a bunch of measurements and fill out a piece of paper. I don't care about the paper. Paper doesn't mean anything. What I want you to do is be very intentional, understanding why am I measuring this? What am I measuring it for? If I were to get this measurement, what does it mean? If I were to get that measurement, what does it mean? Not only that, what would I do to fix it? And what could have caused it, right? So it's a lot of precision measurement on this, and I won't be right there hovering. You know why? Because while you're doing engine overhaul stuff, somebody else is pulling engines out, and they could get hurt more likely than you. So I'll probably be favoring the engine R&R stuff just to make sure everybody's good. You guys are going to be 150 feet apart through 4 doors, and you'll be in there, but if you pay attention and you take your time, you'll learn. Okay, so I'm going to skip this micrometer thing because I want to show you that on the animation one. Here's a couple ways to measure. Like if you have to measure the cylinder, you can use these telescoping gauges, and you're going to, but honestly, this isn't the best tool for the job. So I'm going to show you the telescoping gauge, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of a step up, which is the dial bore gauge, an ASE tool. Okay, but you can use both. You can measure all the cylinders in all the directions. You can measure the crankshaft with the micrometer. Then you can measure the bearing to bearing measurement in the journal with the micrometer. And technically, the difference between those two should be your oil clearance, 0.02 of an inch, but you can verify that with the plastic gauge too. There's a couple ways to measure that. And then small hole gauges, that's how we measure our valve guides, like what we were saying. Remember how we need to measure this valve guide? This is the tool for that. You got to slide the tool in, snug it up so it just barely touches the surface. Then you got to take it out, and you got to get your micrometer, and then you got to measure it. And you got to measure it, and that's how you know. The precision measurement is, it takes some technique. If you needed to measure brake run out, this is what you use, right? But there's a lot more that we could do. We could clip it onto the block, set it on the crankshaft, and try to move the whole crankshaft, and that would measure crankshaft thrust or in play. There's a lot of stuff you're going to do with that dial indicator as well. A lot of times with the vice grips and the snake, maybe with a magnetic base. Lots of work like that. Now regarding everybody who's going to get ready to do the engine removal. Some people will do the engine removal first. Some people will do the overhaul first. I don't know. We'll see. But when you're going to do the engine removal, we got to take all the protection for the... You guys not using fender covers for like a little job, not a real big deal, but if you're going to be over that engine for a long time, getting the engine undone for a day, like it makes sense to have these on. They should be clean though too. The belt buckles, you know, like something like no belt buckle is better than a metal belt buckle. This types of stuff. Be very careful of a windshield. People have broken windshields. Don't be like that to me. If you're pulling the engine out the top, you could pull the hood off. You got to find a good spot for the hood where it's not going to get messed up.
I see most people take the hood off at the dealership.
Where do they put it?
Top.
Well, normally it's a truck, so they'll put it right on the bed.
Yeah.
Or they'll put it right on top of the car, it's like a Camry.
Sometimes we'll put fender covers on top and we'll put the hood upside down.
That's what they do.
As long as like you are not damaging the hood, it's good. But don't try to put it in the corner somewhere, because another class is going to be like, hey, a hood, let's kick it. All right, now organization. You guys did some heavy work on suspension, a little bit in AC. These are going to be big jobs, okay? So if you get way in over your head and you haven't organized and you don't know where stuff goes and you're like, where'd this go? Let me just tell you something. I don't know. I really don't know. Like when I do a job, I try to keep my stuff in order. So you're gonna have to, this is a good chance for you guys to get your organization skills up. We have some Ziplocs, we have some Sharpies, we have some tapes. I even got a couple trays. You can figure out a good way where you're gonna keep your stuff organized. But like, if you need my help, it should be something like this. Hey, I studied and I read the chapter and I heard your lecture, but I don't quite understand, let's say, how to set up the dial bore gauge. Okay, I got you. But say, I don't know where this bolt goes. It's sort of like, no. You got to know where your bolts go. You took the bolts out. You have somebody take something apart, and then you have them call you over and be like, hey, where does this, like, you just don't know. I'm no smarter than you, honestly. I'm more experienced, a little more trained, I'd say, yes. But smarter, no. I don't freaking know. The only bolt I really know is if you were to come over and you were to hand me the steering shaft bolt, because there's only one of those, and a lot of people quit and they're like, I can't get the steering shaft back on, and they don't put it back on, and the next thing you know, a student's trying to move the car, and boom, all of a sudden the steering wheel doesn't work. You're like, I saw one of those. Say, I know where that bolt goes. But the other one, I don't know. Organize it. Now look, some cool things. You can make marks. So there's a scale here. There is like the very, very organized end, which is you label every connector, you label everything, and I could see some value in that. But you're gonna spend a lot of time labeling, and then the other end is rip it all apart, and then be like, I don't know where anything goes, I'm just gonna keep trying until it works. So you should at a minimum be somewhere towards the center where you've got your stuff in order. If you take a bunch of bolts off the exhaust, you may not have to say left side muffler bolt, right side muffler bolt. Just be like exhaust bolts in a bag. I could live with that. That's what I would do. Because I'm gonna be like, all right, I'm doing the exhaust, here's all the bolts. I can kind of tell where everything goes just looking at them, cool. But if you do nothing, I don't know, however you do it, no problem. But don't ask to be bailed out when I'm warning you ahead of time. Keep your stuff straight. Brandon, go ahead.
No, my arm hurts.
Oh, okay, good. So you've heard me on that, okay? Like Mr. Clyde's in there setting up. He likes to label everything. You could do it like that. That's totally cool. If you were to do a job, think about this. If let's say you were to do like Brandon and Daniel want to rebuild some stuff. If you're rebuilding your car and you might not put it back together for a month, 3 months, or a year, I label everything. Yep.
I should have done.
And I do it in marker, in Sharpie, exactly.
And take photos.
But at the shop, let's say you're taking it apart today and you're putting it back tomorrow, maybe you could chill a little bit. When I would do the big jobs, I would start pulling parts off and I'd place them all left to right. Boom, boom. And when I take the bolts, I put the bolts with the part. With the part. And then when I go to reassemble, I go from right to left. And every time I needed the bolts, they were right next to the part. I bring it over and that's when I was pulling cabs off and stuff like that. And those were big jobs. So there was no way to just keep everything in a tray. It was a whole bay. The whole entire bay was parts, all of it. So that's kind of what worked for me. You gotta find your own way. Some of these are cool. If you have organization trays, bring them in. It's all good. Now, when we start working on pulling these engines, there's a way to discharge the fuel pressure. I'm not even going to give you the preview. I'm just going to say, reference TIS for how to discharge the fuel pressure. Otherwise, what I would do, yank the fuel line off and fuel sprays. And it smells, and if the exhaust is hot, let me know. All right, if there's a thermal event out there, I'm going to remember this. And we got it on video. Go ahead.
Can you plug them?
You can, but you don't need to. Once you pull these off, no more fuel's really going to come out, but if you just grab it and pull it, it's still pressurized. If you disconnect the relay and run it till it dies, it depressurizes it, okay? Stop trying to twist my arm. All right, now draining coolant and stuff. You got the radiator petcock, you got one maybe on the engine, you could drain the coolant. Keeping it neat is going to help you. Making a big old sloppy pig pen out there, then walking through your coolant and oil all day, and you walk in here and then you walk to lunch, you will be mopping everywhere you go. So consider draining all the fluids, getting everything really clean, kind of doing a little cleanup, and then continuing rather than just slopping around in your mess. All right? And then here's your hood removal. A little tip on that. Not a bad idea to make some marks. Because when you get the hood back on, you can have it off, you can have fender to hood gaps and stuff. If you make some marks, or at minimum, I don't make the marks. When I pull the bolts, I look really carefully at the paint, and when I bolt it back up, I make sure there's no fresh paint showing. That's how I know it's in the right spot. It works actually pretty well. Cool, and then hooking the engine up, there's a couple different ways, but just being thorough, using the engine hoist. I'll warn everybody now, there's a yellow engine hoist that I really like. It folds up, it's awesome, but last time I went to use it, it's a true story, you unfold it and you have to pin the legs. Well, somebody unfolded it, pinned one of them, couldn't find the other pin and left it, so when I rolled up to it, it looked fine. I personally did not notice one of the pins was missing. I told other students, hey, not T10 by the way, hey, go hook up my Hummer engine that I just rebuilt with all these fabricated headers and all this type of stuff. You can see where this is going. Hook that thing up and roll it over, and they did. And they didn't check for the pin, and I didn't check for the pin. Like, look that one over, because that one has a bunch of pins you can pull, and if you don't put one of those leg pins in, it'll stand there. It'll stay there just fine until you get the engine about this high, and then you know what happens? It literally collapses and falls over. Dents the oil pan, breaks off 2 ignition coils, hurts one guy's finger, go to the health center, got to do paperwork. Mazda, in the meantime, is doing the tour of their new school they're partnering with. Freaking engines on the ground. Right, so I'm learning from my mistakes. Don't assume these engine hoists are in perfect condition, even if you used it yesterday, because someone else could use it in the afternoon and it might be left like a booby trap. All right. Cool. Mounting it on a stand. Actually, you guys are going to get some experience with this either later or tomorrow. I'm going to look for some volunteers. I'm going to give you two options. One, you can do the 2GR, which I have on stands. Or two, if anybody wants to start doing the A25As, you can. But by volunteering for that, you got to get an A25A on the stand and a 2GR off. Because I don't have enough stands to add the A25s till we pull 2GRs. But by the end, we'll be all A25A. And then, we'll jump into disassembly. So with that, we covered everything we needed to cover.
Yeah.